7 shots. A father stands over a lifeless body, his face unreadable, his hands steady. And then, in a voice devoid of regret, he utters 4 words that will haunt the officers forever. He touched my daughter. February 17th, 2024. The night a cop became a killer. A respected officer. A man sworn to uphold the law. But what happens when the very system meant to protect fails? When the monster is the one you were taught to trust? The victim? His own father. The crime? Justice delivered through the barrel of a loaded gun. Javon Tate was not just another man with a tragic past. He was a father who had seen too much, a man who refused to look the other way. And when he stepped into that room, when he saw what was happening, he made a choice. 6 bullets followed the first. Not a moment of hesitation. Not a second of regret. But was it revenge, or was it justice? The law says one thing. His heart told him another. What would you do when the legal system demands patience, but your child has no time left to be saved? When does justice become a crime? This is the heartbreaking case of Javon Tate. Welcome to Echoes of Crime, where real-life cases unravel the hidden truths behind justice and tragedy. Like, comment, and support the channel to help us bring more gripping true crime stories to you. Javon Tate grew up in a world where discipline was law, and failure was never an option. His father, Clifton Tate Sr., a retired Marine Corps officer, was the kind of man whose mere presence commanded a room. A man who didn't need to raise his voice, because silence alone was enough to enforce obedience. In the Tate household, there were no second chances, no excuses, and absolutely no room for weakness. Before school? Push-ups. Before dinner? Drills. Before bed? Silence. Emotions didn't exist, only results did. From a young age, Javon idolized his father. He studied the way Clifton moved, the way his uniform was always pressed to perfection, the way his boots gleamed with military precision. But more than anything, he observed how his father carried himself, with a quiet, unshakable authority. Strength, control, order. These were the pillars of manhood, and young Javon embraced them without question. But beneath the rigid discipline there was something else, something unspoken. Fear. Javon learned quickly that respect in his father's eyes was not given, it was taken. Power wasn't about leadership. It was about control. And in Clifton's world, control was everything. At 18 years old, Javon stood at a crossroads. His path was clear. Follow his father's footsteps into the military or carve his own destiny. Against all odds, he chose law enforcement. Different uniform, same principles. In many ways, the badge was just an extension of what his father had drilled into him. Order, control, respect. Javon thrived in his career, quickly earning a reputation for his sharp instincts, unshakable composure, and relentless commitment to justice. By sworn 25, he was one of the most respected officers in his department. By sworn 30, he was as disciplined as ever. But life has a way of teaching lessons that discipline alone cannot prepare you for. And then, he met Tiana Sanders. She was everything. Javon wasn't. Soft, carefree, full of life. While he thrived in structure, she existed in warmth and laughter. At first, she fascinated him. Then, she taught him. She showed him that love wasn't about control, it was about trust. That a strength wasn't about fear, it was about sacrifice. And for the first time in his life, Javon believed that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to be his father's son. Their love burned fast and deep. Within 2 years, they were married. Shortly after, they welcomed their daughter, Neve. Born premature, tiny, fragile, a fighter from her very first breath. The moment he held her, everything changed. She wasn't just his child. She was his purpose. She was his reason. But happiness was never promised. Neve was not like other children. She didn't react to sounds the same way. She struggled to make eye contact. She rarely cried. At 6 months old, doctors confirmed their fears. Severe Down syndrome. Tiana struggled. She was exhausted, overwhelmed, drowning. Under the realization that Nevaeh would require lifelong care, but Javon adapted. He learned how to hold her when she was overstimulated. He stayed up late researching therapies to help her communicate. He fought for resources, for services, for everything she would need to thrive. And Tiana, she drifted further away. Until one night, she was gone. She packed a bag, kissed Neve one last time, and walked out the door. No explanation, no goodbye, only a note on the counter. "I can't do this. I'm sorry." Javon didn't have time to grieve. He didn't have time to ask why, because now he was all Nevaeh had. And, without hesitation, he became everything. Father, mother, protector, provider. His world revolved around therapy sessions, doctor visits, education plans. He sacrificed sleep, relationships, promotions. Anything that didn't serve to her happiness. But there was one thing he could never sacrifice. The question that haunted him. Did Tiana ever love them? And if she did, why was leaving so easy? Through it all, there was one constant presence, his father. Clifton, the man who raised him to be unyielding, now had a place in Nevaeh's life. Javon trusted him. How could he not? A Marine, a man of honor, a man who demanded respect. He was strict, yes. Unforgiving at times. Never cruel, never dangerous. Or so he thought. But over time, there were signs. The way Neve stiffened when Clifton reached for her. The way she flinched when he said her name. The way she sat motionless instead of curling into her favorite chair. Javon told himself it was just her condition. She processed emotions differently. She struggled with social cues. She wasn't afraid. She couldn't be afraid. Could she? He never asked. Until the night, everything changed. Javon Tate never imagined that love could alter the course of his life so drastically. He met Tiana Sanders. When he was in his 20s, a woman so vastly different from the world he knew that she felt almost like an illusion. Javon was structured, disciplined, methodical, a man raised in an environment where emotions were buried beneath duty. But Tiana? She was soft, warm, and spontaneous, a force of nature untouched by the rigid expectations he had always known. Where he saw Fakin's boundaries, she saw possibilities. Where he valued Kaito control, she thrived in Katan's chaos. Where he held back, she dove in head first. She taught him that love wasn't about discipline, it was about letting go. That strength wasn't about restraint, it was about trust. And he trusted her completely. Their love was fast, intense, consuming. Within 2 years, they were married. Shortly after, they welcomed their daughter, Nevaeh, or Nay for short. Javon had spent his life learning how to protect, lead, and control, but nothing could have prepared him for the overwhelming love he felt the first time he held his daughter. She was tiny, fragile, born too soon, struggling to breathe. The doctors warned them. She was at risk for complications. She would need more care than most children. By the 6 months old, their fears were confirmed. Severe Down syndrome. The weight of those words fell like a slow-moving storm, one Tiana would never recover from. At first, she tried. She sat through doctor's appointments, therapy sessions, sleepless nights. She whispered reassurances into Nay's tiny ears, convincing herself that things would get easier, but they didn't. Exhaustion settled into her bones. The burden of endless responsibility turned her world into a blur of hospital rooms and therapy schedules. While Javon adapted, Tiana withered. She spent more nights crying than sleeping. She grew distant, detached, closed off. She began disappearing for hours, just to catch her breath. And then, one night, she never came back. Javon came home to find a single note left on the kitchen counter. "I can't do this. I'm sorry." No explanation, no goodbye, just an emptiness where his family once stood. He stared at those words for a long time, hoping they would change if he looked long enough, hoping she would walk back through that door and tell him it was all a mistake. But she never did. She left, and with her, the last remnants of the life they had built together. Javon could have fallen apart. He could have collapsed under the weight of the burden suddenly placed on his shoulders. He could have resented the responsibility. But he didn't. Because Neve was still there. And if he couldn't trust anyone else in this world, she could trust him. So without hesitation, he became everything. Father, mother, protector, teacher, advocate. He learned how to hold her when she was overstimulated. He mastered techniques to calm her when the world became too loud. He fought tooth and nail for her education, therapy, and treatment. His entire life revolved around her well-being. He would turn down promotions because they meant less time at home. He would turn down relationships because he knew no one would ever come before Nay. He sacrificed sleep, career growth, and personal time, but never, not for a second, did he regret it. Because Nevaeh was his entire world, and he would protect her at all costs. But what was the cost? It was greater than he could have ever imagined, because while Javon spent nights working overtime to provide for his daughter, he placed his trust in the one man he thought he could rely on. His father. Clifton Tate Sr., a Marine, a man of honor, a man who raised Javon with an iron will, had become an integral part of Nevaeh's life. Javon had no reason to question it. How could he? At first, this seemed like a blessing. Clifton Tate Sr. had stepped back into their lives with an offer to help his son. A retired Marine, a man of rigid discipline. Clifton had never been the kind to show gentleness. But with Nevaeh, he was different. He was patient with her, in a way he had never been with Javon. He was gentle, attentive, and unexpectedly kind, qualities that Javon had never associated with his father. Clifton read bedtime stories to her. He carefully brushed her hair. He bought her small trinkets and gifts. Things he had never done for Javon. Strange, unexpected. But wasn't this a good thing? For the first time, Clifton seemed to be trying to embrace a role he had never played before, a loving grandfather. Javon wanted to believe it. So, he let it happen. He let his father watch Nay on nights he worked late. He let Nay spend weekends at her grandfather's house, bonding, building what Javon thought was a safe and much-needed connection. He let himself believe Clifton had changed, And for a while, everything seemed fine. Until the quite little things started adding up. The first time it happened, Javon barely noticed. A subtle shift. A moment too small, too fleeting to be anything at all. One night, when he picked Nay up from her grandfather's house, she was unusually quiet. Too quiet. Not her usual, but distant, dreamy silence. The kind that came with her condition, but something else, something guarded. Then, Clifton reached for her, and she flinched. It was almost imperceptible. Just a slight tensing of her shoulders, a barely noticeable withdrawal. But it sent a ripple through Javon's mind. He brushed it off. She's just tired. It's been a long day. That's what he told himself. Then, there were more moments. Nay, who usually curled up in her favorite chair, instead sat stiffly on the couch, as if trying to make herself as small as possible. She stopped making her usual humming sounds, the soft noises that comforted her. She stopped bringing her stuffed animals to her grandfather's house. And then, one night, she refused to go at all. Javon had just zipped up her coat, when suddenly she planted her feet firmly against the floor, refusing to move. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" he asked, kneeling beside her. She didn't answer, but when Clifton appeared in the doorway, smiling as usual, her entire body went rigid. A slow, creeping sensation spread through Javon's chest. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. But he couldn't explain it. He told himself he was overthinking, that Nay was sensitive, that she processed emotions differently. Maybe, just maybe, it was nothing at all. But deep inside, a seed of doubt had been planted. And all it took was one night, one horrific truth, for everything to unravel. It started like any other night. February 17th, 2024. Javon's shift ended earlier than expected, a rare occurrence in his line of work. He took it as a small blessing, a chance to surprise Nay with her favorite meal. Crispy fried shrimp and sweet potato fries from a little takeout joint near his precinct. He could already picture her face, lighting up. The way she delighted in the crunch, the way she clapped her tiny hands together when something made her happy. But as he turned onto his father's street, a familiar sense of unease crept in. Something felt off. At first, it was just a feeling. A weight in his chest, a pressure building behind his skull. Then, as he pulled into the driveway, he saw it. The porch light was off. That light had never been off. For years, Clifton Tate had lived by the same routine, a habit ingrained from decades in the Marine Corps. Always leave the light on. Always stay in control. Always be prepared. But tonight, the house sat in darkness. Javon clenched the bag of takeout. His pulse quickened. Something wasn't right. He stepped out of the car, his breath visible in the cold night air. His keys jangled as he reached for the spare, sliding it into the lock with a hand that suddenly wasn't as steady as it should have been. He opened the door and stepped inside. Silence. Not the comfortable silence of night, not the quiet warmth of a home winding down, but a strange, unnatural silence. As if the air had been sucked from the walls. A dim light spilled from the kitchen, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. Everything was exactly as it should be, except for the silence. And then, a sound. Soft, muffled, tense, from down the hall. A strangled whimper. A sharp, gasping breath. Javon's stomach twisted. His body moved before his mind could process. his legs carrying him forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He rounded the corner and froze. Clifton Tate stood at the far end of the room. His robe was half open. His pants had hung loose around his hips. And Nay, his little girl, his entire world, was pressed against the edge of the bed, her tiny body frozen stiff with fear. Her wide, unblinking eyes locked onto him, silently pleading for something she didn't know how to ask for. Javon's mind shattered. There was no logic, no hesitation, no restraint. Only a father's rage, pure, blinding, unstoppable. His hands went numb, the bag of food slipped to the floor. And Clifton. Clifton turned, slowly. His face showed no fear, no guilt, no shame, only cold, calculating control. He raised his hands, his voice deep, steady, eerily calm. "Son, you don't understand what you're looking at." Javon couldn't breathe. Behind him, Nay trembled. She didn't move. She didn't make a sound. The silence of prey. Javon reached for his gun. "She's special, Javon. You know that," Clifton murmured. "Sometimes she misinterprets things." Javon gripped the handle tighter. His entire body shook. Not with fear, but with rage so profound it burned. "Out of every person in this world," he growled, his voice sharp as a blade. "You chose my daughter?" Clifton's lip twitched. "I raised you. I made you the man you are today. You think you'd be standing here without me?" Javon's vision blurred red. "You owe me respect." A breath. A heartbeat. And then the trigger squeezed. The first shot tore through Clifton's chest. His body, jerked back, slamming into the dresser. The second hit his shoulder. The third, his stomach. The fourth. The fifth. By the mighty sixth, Clifton could no longer stand. By the seventh, he could no longer breathe. Javon stood over him in his father's lifeless body. Blood pooled across the hardwood, thick and glistening beneath him. Clifton's eyes flickered, his lips parted, as if to say something. But the light in his gaze faded. And then, nothing. Javon's chest heaved. His ears rang from the gunfire. Behind him, Nay still hadn't moved. She was curled into herself, her tiny hands clutching her knees, rocking gently. He turned to her, his voice raw, barely louder than a whisper. "It's okay now, baby." She didn't look at him. She didn't speak. And in that moment, Javon realized something. She might be safe now, but she would never be the same again. And neither would he. The call came in at about 9:26 p.m. Javon Tate's voice was steady. But there was something chilling, something absolute about his words. "He touched my daughter." No panic, no regret, no attempt to run. He just sat there and waited. When officers arrived, they found him exactly as he had said, sitting on the floor, hands resting on his knees, eyes locked onto the lifeless body of Clifton Tate Sr. The blood pooling beneath Clifton's motionless form had already begun to thicken on the hardwood. 7 wounds. Precise, deliberate. The murder weapon, a standard-issue pistol, lay just within reach. Javon did not move, did not flinch. He didn't try to explain. When officers gave commands, he complied. When they cuffed him, he did not resist. The only thing he said as they led him away, a whisper, barely audible. "Check on my daughter, **. Inside the gray, sterile walls of the interrogation room, Javon Tate sat unmoving. His posture was rigid, as it always had been. His hands were cuffed to the steel table, But there was no struggle. No movement at all. Only the same unshakable resolve that had guided him throughout his career. Detective Kendrick Holloway, a veteran investigator, took a seat across from him, flipping open a thick case file. The weight of the evidence spoke for itself. Blood spatter analysis. Ballistics report. Nay's medical evaluation. There was no question about what had happened. Holloway exhaled, rubbing his hands together before speaking. You know how this works, Javon. Silence. Tell me what happened. Javon's gaze never wavered. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet, steady, without a single trace of hesitation. I shot my father. Holloway leaned forward, fingers clasped together. Why? Javon's response came without pause. He touched my daughter. Holloway sighed. He had heard hundreds of confessions ways in his career. But never one like this. No excuses, no evasions, no fear. Just an undeniable truth. But the law isn't that simple. This wasn't a clear-cut case. And the real battle, the one that would determine Javon Tate's fate, had only just begun. The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the aisles, cameras flashing. The public was divided. Some called Javon a hero. Others insisted he was a murderer. But here, only the law mattered. The prosecution wasted no time. The facts are simple, the lead prosecutor declared. The defendant did not witness a crime in progress. The defendant did not attempt to remove his daughter from harm. The defendant did not call the authorities to handle the situation. Turned toward the jury, voice unwavering. Instead, he acted as judge, jury, and executioner. The weight of those words settled over the courtroom like a thick fog. Javon did not react. His defense attorney, Malcolm Rivers, a seasoned litigator known for his relentless approach, rose to counter. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Rivers began, voice slow but firm, laced with absolute conviction. Javon Tate did what any father would do. He walked into a nightmare, a betrayal by the very man who raised him. He gestured toward the evidence laid bare before the court. Hospital records. Forensic evidence. Child psychologist reports on knee. The real question isn't whether Javon pulled the trigger. We all know that he did. He let the moment hang in the air. The question is, did he even have a choice? A ripple of whispers spread through the crowd. The prosecution fired back immediately. The law is not about emotion. It is not about personal justice. It is about order. If we justify this, if we allow anyone to take the law into their own hands, then we are no better than the criminals we seek to stop. He turned, locking eyes with the jurors. Javon Tate was a trained officer of the law. He knew better than anyone. A pause. But he didn't do better. The jury remained impassive. Javon never wavered. But this was no longer his decision. His fate now rested in their hands. And when the verdict was read, it would determine whether he was a grieving father or a man who had just thrown his entire life away. Justice is not always swift. Justice is not always fair. And sometimes, justice comes at an unimaginable cost. The story of Javon Tate is one of love, sacrifice, and the painful limits of the law. A father who did what he believed was necessary, what any parent might have done in his place. Yet, in the eyes of the law, justice is not determined by emotion. It is governed by order, precedent, and the rules that exist to prevent chaos. But the question remains. What happens when those rules fail the ones who need protection the most? Javon Tate did what the system should have done. He protected his child. He ended years of abuse. He eliminated a predator who thrived in the shadows of silence. But at what cost? The law only saw his crime. It did not see the sleepless nights, the unspoken fears, the trust shattered by the one man he was supposed to rely on. And so, as Javon faced his sentence, we are left to ask ourselves, is this justice? Or is this the survival in its most primal form? This case is not just a crime. It is a lesson. A lesson about the cracks in our legal system. A reminder that justice does not always move fast enough for those who need it most. A lesson about the dangers of silence. How predators thrive when we look away, when we miss the signs, when we refuse to believe that evil can exist among us. And above all, a lesson about the weight of a father's love. Javon Tate never intended to be a criminal. He never intended to take a life. But when faced with the unthinkable, he made a choice. What would you guys have done? The truth is often darker than fiction. If this story moved you, if it made you question the true meaning of justice, stay informed. Like, comment, subscribe. Because the world is filled with Muslim stories like this, stories that need to be heard. And sometimes, knowing the truth is the only defense we have left.